Hey there, friends, and welcome to your Lucid Living Show, where you join and participate with us in our essential conversations with ordinary people achieving the extraordinary. The Lucid Living Show is brought to you and sponsored by themindfulnessadvantage.com. Our wingman and producer today is Andy Brine of hangouttribes.com. Thank you for staying with us for the next hour. Today, our featured guest, Kellan Fluckiger, and I launch and begin the Lucid Living Show's new 4-week series, No Ordinary Moments. Today, Kellan and I are inviting you to join us in bringing from the shadows and into the light a subject that until recently was for the most part avoided. Depression and anxiety are all too common in our rapidly accelerating culture, and Kellan Fluckiger is one of our rare breed of friends and leaders that has chosen to be authentically vulnerable and unvarnished in sharing his own personal journey of great and high successes matched by the deep valleys of his own shadow. Kellan is publishing his latest book and personal story, Tightrope of Depression, My Journey from Darkness, Despair, and Death to Light, Love, and Life. And it's going to launch in early 2015. And Kellan has also launched a Kickstarter campaign to shed grace, the light of awareness, and love upon those who have and are working in the valley of their own shadows. If you'll scroll down to the bottom of the event description, you'll see the link to the Kickstarter page, and we'll be posting that up at the end of the show and in the middle in the comment stream. We'll be bringing Kellan on in just a few moments after our opening segment, First Words. Those of us who live to bring our own and others' visions to life, those who forge forward with faith and fire, trailblazers, visionary leaders, mentors, masters, and our models for success, each and every one of us are entirely human and perfectly imperfect. All too often, when we look up to someone we hold in high regard, much like many in our culture do, we avoid looking into the darker recesses and the deeper shadows of who they are. And so, too, we often do our best to keep hidden and secret our own depth of doubt, of our overwhelming uncertainty, and what we often hide in the darkness of our own shadows, our depression and despair. The tragic and shocking news of Robin Williams' long struggle with depression and his end by taking his own life shook us all. We who grew up with his brilliance and comedy and his incredible acting abilities. His tragic death brought to light and into our national discussions for a time a most necessary, authentic, and compassionate dialogue about depression. The truth we all share is quite simply between love and loss, life and death, experiencing our sadness, our grief, and our heavy hearts along the way is simply a part of our own journey. And rather than trying to hide or escape our shadow, our key to truly thriving is to face and embrace it. One of my favorite authors, Stephen Pressfield, devoted the first third of his book, The War of Art, to recognizing, mastering, and ultimately making friends with our own resistance, our doubt, and yes, even our depression. The truth is, the more consistently you forge ahead, growing, evolving, and stretching into your greatest dreams and visions, the more consistently you will encounter your shadows of resistance, doubt, and more. What we resist persists. What we stuff or deny or try to ignore remains until one day we choose to live with and make friends with our shadow rather than be ruled by it. Again, our featured guest today is Kellan Fluckiger. Kellan, thank you so much for joining me and joining us today. And if you will, share with our audience your business background and how you became inspired to write your current book on overcoming depression.
My business background is long. A 30-year history in as an executive in electricity in 2 countries and a world traveled speaker, actually, on the electricity market design. So I had a lot of large success there, and on the parallel track during that same 30 years, I had a recording career. So I owned a recording studio for 30 years. I've been a executive in 2 countries. The funny part of that is I did actually have a contract with the Queen of England at one time, which is kind of funny. I get to say that. I never met the Queen, but hey, I had a contract with the Queen. Because all the contracts with the Canadian provinces say it's with the Queen of England in right of Alberta, which is where I had the job working for the Minister of Energy. So that's a business background. I retired from that after 30 years in 2007, and since then, the last 7 years, I've spent time building a coaching business and helping people, 2 kinds of coaching, actually. One is a business coaching business, which has to do with marketing and principally personal story, which you're going to hear some of mine today. And the other part is breakthrough work, which I really, really enjoy, because my greatest passion and the gift that I have, if you think about what's called the zone of genius in Gay Hendricks' book, The Big Leap, is helping people do the things they don't believe they can do with tools they don't know they have and power they don't know they control. So that's a really short version of business background, and underlying all of that is what we're going to talk about today, and the spectacular highs and lows of that were mostly invisible to the outside world, except during the spectacular crashes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's a common story, and again, a story that's usually held underneath the level of sharing and vulnerability. So one, I'm really delighted that you're with us today. Friends, what Kellan and I shared with each other is we have a common background and some great successes. Mine are sort of pale in comparison to what you've achieved, but I'm not finished yet. But also, what often comes with great vision, with brilliance, with great achievements, again, as I said in the open, is that we are required to confront our shadow and make friends with our shadow. And so what I'd love to do is invite you to sort of fast forward to the last year, if you would, and talk about your most recent epiphany and the fact that, well, first, friends, Kellan has a 2-day book challenge, and that's fabulous. I plan on diving into that next year, early in Q1. But if you would share your story about the book that you thought you were going to write and the one that you eventually did write, and why we're here today.
Well, I listen very strongly to the voice. The spirit, the intuition, the thing that calls you to do certain things that sometimes don't make sense. So I've learned a long time ago that that is important, and if you really want to do what you came here to do and do your higher good things, you got to pay attention. So I run something called the 2-day book challenge that George observed, and it's where people get together and I coach them through a very, very intense 2 days, and they write a book. And it's very successful, and I've got another one here in December, and I launched it kind of as an experiment, October, November, December, and it worked, so I'm going to run it into next year, and I'll be glad to have George on board. That'll be fun. Anyway, so I promised my coachees that I would write a book with them during the challenge to demonstrate its efficacy, even though I'd done it on myself before I did the first one. And as I got ready to do the one in October, about a week before, it was suddenly impressed upon my mind that I should write, quote, this book, unquote. And I had someday planned to write the book, but not now. And so I sort of argued and said, no, you got to be kidding. One, it's too hard, it's too painful, and it's going to be too long anyway to get it done like that, even with my intense coaching work across the 2 days. And so I lost the argument with myself and began to I just made peace with the fact that I had to do it. So the knowledge that I would write it someday was with me. I hadn't planned to do it now, but it was impressed upon me very strongly that this was the time to do it. This was the time to launch this whole project, which has turned into what you referred to, this Kickstarter campaign and a really significant outreach which I'm really happy with the people that have responded. So far, I'm excited about the project.
Yay. And a pretty amazing story. One, it's interesting. I was doing some research because Kellan and I are going to co-produce a four-episode series we'll be announcing this week. And as I did research looking for experts on depression, all I heard was crickets out there in the Googleverse. It's such a taboo subject that, I mean, you can go Google anxiety and boom, you've got a lot. But it's, again, such a taboo subject that there's not a lot of information out there. And the reality is that depression and anxiety are so common, all too common. And so in terms of your own arc, your own story, and in writing this book, I would imagine that writing the book was some sort of catharsis for you, yes?
Absolutely cathartic. And I wrote it for three reasons, which I capture in the introduction. One, it was I needed to write it as part of the journey. I needed to write it, and then the second and third reason would be obvious, to help people that have it and might find some use in my descriptions, and then to help those that perhaps live with or are responsible for or feel like they're responsible for someone who is afflicted that way. So those are my three reasons, but the strongest motivation, besides helping, was that I needed to do it as part of the journey.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And how would you characterize the difference that, for me, writing a book and the catharsis that you described, and then my own imagined experience in documenting my journey from my own valley of shadow into some relative state of ascendancy, how different is the world in your world today because of your willingness to walk with your shadow and actually take action rather than being ruled by it, your depression?
Well, so I have a story to describe part of this, and I can describe it in a minute when you're ready with that, about how this started. But to answer your question directly, it's completely different, worlds apart. And mainly because I didn't understand what was wrong. It's not like I had been being treated for some long time for this condition. So my treatments have begun, in terms of the whole decades, 30 years of my process, and I'm guessing at about 30 years, are very recent in terms of 30 years. And so the difference is night and day. And I'm a classic case of what happens when this condition remains undiagnosed and untreated, because the oscillations kept getting bigger and bigger, and clearly would have led to the same kind of outcome as Robin Williams. I mean, I was at the point of death a number of times. So it is salvation, that size.
Amen. That's so we're going to do a quick station ID here, and then Kellan, I'm going to invite you to jump into your story of how this all started. You're watching the Lucid Living Show, and this is our inaugural issue or episode of No Ordinary Moments. And we have with us today Kellan Fluckiger of Kellan Fluckiger International, and we are talking about the journey up out of the shadow of depression and into a new life of thriving. So if you would, Kellan, tell us how this all started.
So I woke up and my face was wet. I didn't really know where I was, and it took me a while to recognize my surroundings. I realized after a time that I was in my own bed, and the sheets and bedclothes were so soaked that it felt like someone had dumped water all over them, but no one had been in the room. So I'm not sure what that was, and I'm actually not sure what happened. And so what had happened, as far as I could understand, in the previous 17 hours and I was only able to determine the length of time by looking at the clock, is I had been out of body. And I know that sounds crazy, and the best way I can describe it is think of Scrooge in A Christmas Carol, when an extraordinary amount of stuff was crammed into one night on the verge of the impossible. Those who listen and watch who believe that those sorts of things are impossible are going to perhaps argue with this and so forth, but that doesn't really matter. What I experienced was that, an out-of-body experience, only mine was not pleasant, and it was not like light and fun. It felt just like Ebenezer Scrooge, that I had the opportunity to see and feel a future of torment and pain. So if I were to just articulate what it felt like I had been to hell for the 17 hours, and at the end of that period of time, I heard a voice that said, "It is enough." I then returned to consciousness, left to consider all of those things and figure out what all of that meant. How I interpreted that was a divine intervention that ended up saving my life and setting me on a path to recovery. That was only the first of several miraculous things that happened. The next and most profound of all of them was a week later I met my wife, Joy, who has been impossibly important in helping me move through these changes and through this journey. And then over the several years, that happened in about 2007. So over the last 7 years, that journey of discovery, of awakening, of finally coming to grips and putting a name on the enormous cycles of wild success and staggering crashes that I had had, some of them national news size. And that's why I say that the private part was not really for me. But that kind of thing, I was able to make sense out of it, and finally now am in a position to put names on things, to operate at a level of clarity, sanity, and productivity without the mask. I don't mean mask of hiding, but I mean the clouds, the shadow covering everything that I did, and learning to feel and be whole again. So that's a really short condensation of about 30 years, and just kind of describing the immersion and the events of emergence that started about 7 years ago.
Mm-hmm. You know, for me, your being unvarnished and vulnerable here is an inspiration. You're an inspiration in general. That's why I'm enjoying having you here and collaborating with you. And my moment here of vulnerability and truth is that I suffered from anxiety and depression for most of my life, as much as I can remember. I was more aware of my anxiety, and having a partner, whether it's a romantic partner, a friend, or someone that you enroll in your process, is key, not only to managing, but to mastering our emotional difficulties, whether it's depression or anxiety or even apathy. What I find is the people I encounter and myself, my journey was more of a solitary journey, because we don't talk about our depression. We don't want to reveal our vulnerability. We think we're broken when your shadow just means you're perfectly human again. And again, the people who stretch the farthest are the ones that dig the deepest into that shadow. But what I had shared with Kellan was, I had a friend of mine who was treating me for some lung difficulties. I got exposed to black mold. And so, as it turns out, vitamin D sublingual helps with breathing. But another one of its uses is it lifts your mood. And as soon as I started using vitamin D, within the first 2 days, I felt as though a cloud had lifted. And through the help of my own mentors and coaches and some people who were expert in Chinese medicine, I figured out I had been living with medium to mild depression, sometimes pretty severe, for as long as I could remember. But I had acclimated to that, to the point that that became the new normal. And there's nothing normal about our struggles when they're that deep and that dark, especially when we're trying to manage it ourselves. So how key was it, Kellan, for you to actually, one, take responsibility and recognize, have your epiphany around what you had been dancing with and struggling with for the better part of your life, or 30 years, and then turn to any or whatever professionals that you had engaged with for help? How key was that?
Well, so there's a little piece of the book that I want to read to set the stage for the answer to that, and I think it's actually quite good. It says, so here's part of the preface to the book. And it's essentially done, and the good news is I have an opportunity perhaps to get it published, not self-published, so I'm really, really excited about that as well. But anyway, so here's what I say. I'm not an expert at understanding, diagnosing, or treating depression, and I'm not an expert at understanding all the medical details, causes, or current thinking on managing this seemingly increasingly frequent condition. I'm not even sure it's increasing, but it just seems like it. Or maybe it seems like it because I have it and hate it and am affected by it so much. I am, however, an expert at having it and hating it. I'm an expert at running from it, living with it, hiding from it, wondering what to do about it, ignoring it, accommodating it, being debilitated by it, and pretending it doesn't exist. That is a certainly non-exhaustive list of the strategies that we use when we're busted. We think we're supposed to suck it up and be unbusted without help. And that's the condition I went through. I had assigned myself the blame totally for everything I felt and everything that was wrong, and that I bore responsibility for all of everything. And I'm not saying people aren't responsible for their actions. I am, you are, we all are. But the setup had been one of us, my assuming responsibility for everything around me, and that if I was less than perfect, I was no good. And I lived with a little voice on my shoulder that shouted not good enough all my life. And it was in fact that voice that drove me to the insane achievements of 2 or 3 lifetimes worth of stuff crammed into one life, world class in several areas, and never being okay. And eventually feeling like I don't deserve this success, and so I would sabotage it, even from high levels. I likened it to being, pushed out of the 34th story of the corner office and crashing to the pavement, and then, doing it again. And every time the cycle repeated, it got bigger and bigger until I finally was able to understand this is not how it's supposed to work. There's something else going on here besides yelling at myself in the mirror that I suck, which was kind of the standard operating procedure about everything that went wrong. And so the first epiphany that mattered so much was to just say something's wrong. I don't care what I hear or what people say about sucking it up and doing this and that and the other. I need some help. This is broken. The second thing was to, after saying that, to actually take the step of seeing some people, telling them what had been going on in my life, because I'd always lied. I always made stuff up. I didn't want to share it. I hid it completely and was extraordinarily successful at that, and very successful outwardly, but inwardly having lost all ability to feel. And so having then for the first time telling the truth to somebody about my cycles and journey, and having them stare at me in disbelief and say, you're lucky to be walking. You're lucky to be alive at all. And then say, the diagnosis is obvious. We need to try this, that, and the other. And so admitting something's broke, coming out of the shame and the stigma, which was drilled in me from a small kid, that is, you can't do that, it's your fault, you suck it up, and et cetera, the stories many people have. And then getting some help and having an open and willing heart to take some steps and some action. So that was critical, and that kind of in that order.
this is such an empowering story. And what I'm noticing, we're going to do a quick ID here. It's the Lucid Living Show. You're with me and Kellan Fluckiger, and we're talking about bringing depression out of the shadows and into the light, and not only dealing with it in a functional way, but learning how to thrive beyond that. What I'm noticing, and one of the things we're talking about, is how much of an avoided subject this is that we have, this show has the second best opt-in rate, and we have the worst comment rate. So what I'm going to do is invite you people to step into your own breath and courage and get involved. Throw down with some comments, whether live or in the replay. We invite you. You're just as important in our conversation as the one Kellan and I are having, and we invite your comments and your questions. Kellan, there's another aspect here before we get into exploring your Kickstarter campaign and what your vision is for greater service in your own ascendancy. And that is two things. One, which we've already talked about, the critical importance of partnering with people, recognizing that this is not something we try to do alone. In fact, what really is key to our ascendancy and our thriving is partnering with people who are inspired to help us. But then there is the spiritual aspect. Because as you shared your story, your story is one of divine intervention. And so how did your faith allow you to receive that kind of vision, that out-of-body vision, dream state, whatever it was, communication? How did your faith allow you to take that in and understand it better?
So it's really, really simple. I was raised having faith. I was raised believing in a God in a particular religious tradition. It was interpreted really strictly and applied ruthlessly with a lot of physical punishment, stuff that today would land people in jail for felony child abuse. But setting all that aside, I had an innate faith in God. That didn't drive away faith in God and in a God. My answer to everything was that I wasn't good enough for his attention. And that I did not deserve any help, and that I was, if I could just be better, if I could just do more, was sort of the constant refrain. And that was in light of the fact that I was making millions, I was at the pinnacle of success, I was known around the world in my discipline. Despite all of those outward tokens of success, inwardly I was spiritually bankrupt, I was emotionally bankrupt, and suffering entirely all the time from I'm not good enough. If I could just do more. It was a constant refrain. And so when that happened, it was a total meltdown for me inside, because what it demonstrated to me, by meltdown in a good way, it was that all of the history of my believing that I was not good enough, to the point where I would hide from the notion of being watched by God, not even because I was ashamed, but because I felt unworthy. It just got rid of all that. I had known that there was a supreme existence, call it whatever you like, and to have it pay attention to me for a brief span of hours, and have it do something like not only intervene that way, but then introduce me to the one person that I've ever met in my life who would have the patience and the wisdom and the foresight and the courage and the love to walk with me through this thing, literally a week, 2 weeks later, and it was impossible. And the meeting and the whole story would take another show, but the whole setup was just impossible. There were a number of literally impossible things that happened leading up to this, and they all happened in the space of about a month. And so it was clear to even someone as thick-headed as I had been inclined to be, that there was a path here and there was something more to do. So my faith was there. I viewed myself as inadequate and not deserving, and the actions of God dictated, determined, demonstrated that that simply wasn't true. And after that I said, well, if he wants me here that bad and he's willing to do all this stuff, then I'm going to pay attention.
Yay.
It's as simple as that.
Yeah. Well, and Not everybody has the great benefit of that kind of divine wake-up call, but we all have the potential to call that into our lives. And so one of the reasons I invited Kellan onto the show is that I resonate with his story. And I know enough people, and I know and have enough common sense to know that many, many other people resonate with our stories as well and have a great desire to overcome the hallucination of not being enough. We are children of our Creator, and by that virtue, we are creators ourselves, and we are divine beings. The hallucination of separation, the hallucination of suffering, the hallucination of that we are alone is drilled into our heads from the beginning, and it's simply not true. So we have to trust our hearts, and we have to trust our partners and our friends to embrace us along the way in our journey. So let's dive into your greater vision for service, why you're writing the book, and I'm going to go ahead with permission and put up the Kickstarter campaign URL, and let's talk about that now.
Okay, well, I want to just make one other little comment based on something you said, and I want it really clear that I don't think in any way, shape, or form that because I received such a miraculous manifestation in my own mind, life, that I'm any better than anybody else. Quite the contrary. I felt like it was my thick-headedness that necessitated such a hammer blow to the density, I guess, or whatever. Everyone is entitled to and will receive that kind of guidance and help as far as my own view is concerned.
That's a great piece and a more refined definition of what I'm saying. I'm in total agreement with you. The reality is help is there. Providence and grace and the Spirit of God are there and ready for us to receive comfort and guidance and help, period. So go ahead, please.
So to answer your question, the book came about as part of the journey. So I began to be healthy. I began to look for things to do. The sense of gratitude was awakened in me that was deep and profound. The sense of gratitude for my own rescue, a sense of gratitude for the journey, a sense of gratitude for my wife, a sense of gratitude of learning what it meant to have a friend and be a friend, of what loyalty was about, concepts that had been completely foreign to me. I didn't understand them, didn't know how to do them. The depth of the brokenness, was that way, and I'd been so isolated. And so all of those things being repaired awakened in me the sense of deepest gratitude. And so my goal is to, even in my coaching practice, before I determined to do the project, excuse me, was to help people, whatever their state, to get past those same kinds of barriers that I know are in many people. In fact, in most, at one degree or another, everybody probably to some degree. But anyway, so that was my genesis, and then it sort of coalesced into, well, I needed to tell the story. I needed to describe it in enough detail so that people can understand and resonate, as you said, with this feeling, and to allow them to take strength and courage from the journey. So the impression that I should write the book now came really strongly. We were thinking about, Joy and I were thinking about, as business partners, what do we do to make this available? And she just said she'd been looking at something in an airplane magazine as we were flying back from a place I was speaking, and she simply said, let's just do a Kickstarter project. And so we devised the project, and one of the things about it was I've been a recording artist also for 30 years. I have some 10 albums up of music that I've done throughout my career and so forth. So we then tied music to it, because music is the window to the soul and a powerful connector. And so I'm doing 2 original albums of music, one of up songs, they're called Songs of Promise and Power, and one of the dark side, and I don't really have a name for that album yet, but the songs are written. I was recording last night on one of them. Several of the songs are done, and so I'm moving ahead with it. And the purpose of the Kickstarter campaign is to get the book done, published, out there, and available. It is to get the albums completed and do all of the artwork and distribution necessary for that. I also paint, So as some of the awards for the Kickstarter, I've offered some paintings. The painting career that I have has only been since I met Joy, but I actually have had some success. I have some in South America and in Canada and in galleries around the U.S. Some have been sold in that way. So it's not been something I've done for 30 years, like almost everything else, but only 7. So those things are all involved in the campaign, and the sole purpose of this campaign is to provide, I hate the word raising awareness because it sounds like we're just going to talk, to provide resources, dialogue, and some action around this otherwise taboo subject. Like when Robin Williams died, it was in the news and the media for a while, and then it slips back into oblivion, sort of below the noise level. And I just can't let that happen.
And I agree. That's why we're here partnering today. I've danced with depression. My entire family, both sides of my family, my mother's family, my father's family, they have a history of it. So there is an ancestry, there's a legacy, there are theories out there that it's also genetic. The reality is that we have an opportunity ourselves to break that chain, that familial chain, that ancestral chain, and make a change for ourselves and for our world. Now, this is a great comment. If you would bring this up and read it for us, Andy.
Yeah, this is an interesting comment from Vivek, and it's Kellan, are you saying only with external and possibly medical help you could overcome the problems you faced? I have taken to doing medication as a way to keep my mind sane, but I've not had much success as well. I'm spiritual by upbringing.
Mm-hmm. So that was meditation, not medication. And
so let me address that. Yeah, I would love to. Thank you, George. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I have written 5 books on meditation, and I have been doing it for 40 years. I think that it is very powerful, and another of the strong keys to it, there's a nutritional aspect, likely, what we put into our body. Meditation is a key thing, and I would urge to continue. In fact, I teach that in my coaching practices. It simply wasn't sufficient for me. I'm not going to draw conclusions for anyone else. It wasn't enough. If I speculate on what I would be like without it, that's a scary thought, because it does benefit me. I did so for an hour this morning. I mean, it's a daily ritual. And what I would find is, even though I would sometimes meditate for an hour in the morning, and I would set myself up for success, slight things would then sort of jar that, and I would create this spiral that anybody that knows this is familiar with. And so it was successful, but I could not, and I'm not saying anything about meditation, I couldn't get it to last outside of some external stimuli, and so it was helpful, and I wouldn't even suggest doing it without it. It just wasn't enough for me.
Mm-hmm. That's really important, friends. And I'm going to speak to that in an artful way here in our final segment, your moments in mindfulness. Kellan, we're going to go ahead and put the Kickstarter link up again after the show. My invitation to you is to create your own invitation for inspiration and call to action. Now, before we jump into the final segment, how would you like and love to inspire our audience?
Number one, if you struggle with any of these, anxiety, and my particular one is depression, you're not alone. You're not alone, and there's nothing wrong with you in terms of being unnormal. George is right. This is part of being human. We all have things that we need to be fixed for. If I have a cold, if my arm breaks, if I have the flu, I go get some help. This particular thing, depression, somehow has been remedied always by, okay, come on, suck it up and you'll be okay. That's not a good answer, and it leaves a person isolated and feeling additionally inadequate, because regardless of how hard you try to suck it up, there is this other cloud that clouds your judgment, your mind, and your ability to sort of think positively. And so don't feel alone. Don't be afraid to talk about it. And if those that you talk to are not receptive, find somebody else, because your own safety, sanity, and health are at risk. So my invitation to you would be, don't be afraid. Talk about it, find some help, and find your way out of the cloud. There is a way to live with this. There is a way to be successful with it. My invitation to you also is, if you feel at all called, please support the Kickstarter campaign. Kickstarter is all or nothing. So if I don't get it funded, nothing happens. So if you're inclined at all to support this feeling, please go there, and we'll have the links in the show. And I appreciate the opportunity to talk about it.
Well, Kellan, I appreciate your courage. Again, we require models, and quite often the models we construct in our mind, the story we make about our heroes or our models or masters, doesn't include their humanity. And so, one, I just appreciate you and your humanity and being, again, unvarnished and vulnerable in making your call to an invitation to inspiration and action. So, again, stick around. Right after we go off the air, I'm going to go ahead and put the Kickstarter link back in comments. And we welcome your continuing comments. We welcome your sharing this show with your friends and family, because now this time of the year is a time where people really tend to dip into their blue state, into their shadowy depression. This is the time we can reach out for help for ourselves, or reach out and offer our hearts and hands to our friends and family. So get off the bench, friends, get in the game, and be inspired to support and love and help your friends and family. I really appreciate, Kellan, you joining me today. And now it's time for your moments in mindfulness. This is quite simple and elegant. I had a dear, beloved friend, someone that I was in a relationship with for some time. We had conversations that were open and vulnerable, like the ones we've had today, as we both sat with and made friends with our own depression, our own anxieties. And she invited me to write about her process. And so I'm simply going to leave you with this piece that is an excerpt from my coming book, Prayers for the Beloved, and allow this to be my call to inspiration and action. Call upon your courage. Your door is open. The question is, how does one wake up and finally walk out of our house of old? This old house contains our past, our memories. This old house contains our consciousness and our unconsciousness, steeped in our consent to limit, to doubt, to fear, and to our shadows. Some of us have invested year upon year taking that old house down, brick by brick, board by board, all the while still living there, until one day, after seemingly endless cycles of deconstruction, release, then surrender, we finally pause. We stop working and start being. In this, our respite and rest, the haze and dust of years of our work begins to settle and clear. Where once stood a house of old, now stands a single open door frame. The walls and clouded windows are no more. Where once was roof and ceiling, now the night sky stretches forth out beyond the horizon. In this, your chosen moment, you step through the open door frame now, traveling light, stepping into an ever-expanding space of a heart now opening, of a heart now opened. With newly rediscovered and liberated senses, and with your original eyes of remembrance. What has always been true and eternal is being revealed again for you to hear, to feel, and to see. The heart once opened is as vast and infinite as the dark yet diamond-bright night sky. Each glimmer of brilliance and light brings hope and wonder and enchantment to this night. Be still, beloved. Wait and listen as this starry blanket of the night is impregnated with the sun's golden seed of the new morning's light. Walk in grace and in gratitude, each and every step a prayer. I want to thank again Kellan Fluckiger for joining me in launching our 4-week series, No Ordinary Moments. And I want to thank you for joining us in Courage, in joining us in our conversation around bringing depression out of the shadows and into the light. Join us next Tuesday at this same time as Crystal Cassane joins us, and she'll be talking with me about conscious conception. She is 40 years old and having her first baby with her beloved husband, Artemis Cassane. And we're also using that as a model for imagining and creating consciously our visions, our outcomes, and our dreams. So join us, and thank you again for being on the program today. I'm George E. Green, and this is the Lucid Living Show. We'll see you next time.